Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Emma Rathie. I'm the manager of programs and exhibition production here at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. Welcome to today's virtual In Focus lecture. If you're not familiar, an In Focus lecture kind of provides some insight to behind the scenes. It lifts the veil a little bit to the work that goes on in our archives, in our collection spaces. Often it highlights projects that don't come to fruition in an exhibition. So our curatorial staff is going to shed some light for all of you today. At the George Eastman Museum, as we approach and celebrate our 75th anniversary, we are featuring a group of exhibitions that highlight a wide range of holdings from the museum's collection. With this selection of objects in the collection gallery, we continue our broad survey of works to draw parallels and connections between photography, history, and culture. The objects chosen for this exhibition will chart a course through this history, identifying notable movements and trends while giving context to a breadth of photographic practices, technologies, communities, and traditions. Today, you will hear from Jamie M. Allen, the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Curator and Head, Daniel Peacock, Assistant Curator, and Louis Chavez, our Curatorial Assistant, all three in the Department of Photography here at the museum. They will discuss their collaborative approach to selecting and exhibiting material from the museum's vast photography collection. They will highlight the strengths of this notable collection, the strategies they use to exhibit a range of artists and movements, and discuss the nuances of representing the history of photography in a single museum gallery. I invite you all to visit our collections gallery to see objects from our technology collection alongside many of the photographs shown in today's presentation. I'd also like to tell all our George Eastman Museum members that tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. we are having a members-only tour of selections from the collection. That being said, at the start of this presentation, we had 2 slots left, so if you want to join that tour, space is very limited, but be sure to register on our website. And if you aren't able to join us here on site, we do have a virtual tour of this exhibition on our website, and I will drop the link in the chat for those who are interested in a moment. I want to express gratitude and appreciation to our sponsor. The Collection Gallery is sponsored in part by ESL Federal Credit Union. Couple housekeeping things, and then we'll get started, I promise. If you have questions today during the presentation, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. This should be located at the top or the bottom, depending what device you're using today. And at the end of the talk, we will try and get through as many of those questions as possible. The chat function is open, but we are not monitoring for that. We're not monitoring that for questions right now. Feel free to use it to say hello, where you're from, but please use the Q&A button if you'd like our curators to answer your question. We are recording today's talk and we'll put it on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to rewatch it later or share it with friends, you'll be able to do so. And you'll also be able to find many of our other previous virtual and public programs on our YouTube channel. But without taking any more time, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie Allen to get us started.
Thank you, Emma. And thanks for organizing today's talk. Like Emma was saying, it's really fun for us to get to kind of lift up the veil and show you a little bit about what we do here at the museum and how things come into being. And that's not always straightforward, I don't think. People think that an exhibition just kind of appears on a wall. But there's a lot of thought that goes into an exhibition. And then this one in particular, we wanted to test some things. So we want to give you a little bit of background on that, show you some of the objects that we selected, and talk about our collaborative process. The selections from the collection exhibition for our museum started in 2014 under the leadership of Lisa Hostetler. And at that point in time, the goals of that exhibition were really to show a broad history of photography, from the invention to contemporary photography, in this one gallery space alongside technology objects. And the technology objects are selected separately by our curatorial team in the technology department. We're now at 20 exhibitions that we've done, 20 different rotations of selections from the collection. They've ranged from kind of best of exhibitions to thematic exhibitions to everything kind of in between. But with this 20th exhibition, we wanted to kind of rethink what we were doing in the gallery space a little bit. And I'll take onus for it because the thought behind it happened before Louis and Daniel were on our team. At the time, it was we were down a lot of curators. And I was thinking about how this kind of concept of, if we were to renovate our galleries in the future and make a permanent exhibition of the history of photography, alongside technology. How could we implement that? Because showing photographs on the wall is so problematic in the sense that they often can't stay up for more than sometimes 3 months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year. So there's kind of all these different challenges we have to showcasing the objects in our collection. So running against this problem of how do we create a permanent installation like art museums and history museums do all over the world, but without having the same objects permanently on display. So really thinking about that, thinking about how we can highlight the strengths of our collection, how we can always illustrate the full history of photography, and think about the strengths of our particular collection in terms of highlighting the different processes that went into the history of photography and its development, and really thinking about how all of that can be on these 4 little walls in a gallery, which isn't a lot of space. In the past, 20 objects to 30 objects was typically what we were fitting in that room. In addition to that, like I said, we were trying to think about future planning. How might we orchestrate a permanent history of photography by being able to swap things out in an easy manner? So we'll talk a little bit about that today too. And also, we just always want to provide you with more. As visitors to our institution and people who are interested in our collection, we want to show you as much as we can because we get excited about the history. I mean, it's hard to eliminate things off of a checklist. So we tried to add more on this time to see what that might look like as well. As you can see in this picture, kind of made some groupings in the exhibition. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, one of our goals was to show both known and unknown examples from the history of photography. So we'll also discuss that. So probably the easiest kind of method that we tried to employ as we were looking for ways to update this exhibition on a somewhat regular basis was looking for one-for-one swaps within our collection. So places where our collection is so deep, we have so many objects of the same size, technique by the same artist, that we could literally take one off the wall and put one on the wall, and they'd be the same size frame, same orientation, very similar concepts, so that there's always more to explore, but we're kind of keeping those objects in preservation mind and conservation mind fresh as well. So in this case, you see 3 different photographers or photographic firms represented. On the left, Julia Margaret Cameron. And then on the right, there's Hill and Adamson and Southworth and Hawes. And in particular, this Hill and Adamson and Southworth and Hawes was something I was excited about because both of those are pretty deep within our holdings. We have one of the largest collections of Southworth and Hawes, a portrait studio out of Boston, but also because those are a salted paper print and a daguerreotype. And that is the first really 2 processes at the invention of photography. So visitors have the ability to one-for-one compare those objects right at the start of this exhibition and see kind of the ways that salted paper prints and daguerreotypes portray the world and what might be good and bad about those processes, and then think about what kind of won out in the long run too. Another object that we wanted to highlight was this Andy Warhol album that we received in 2013. We were one of 6 institutions to receive one of these, quote, family albums. And I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, but the family album comes from the flyer that came with that album. It's just a standard family photographic album that anybody could have purchased in the 60s and 70s. That Andy Warhol used to put and gather his photographs in. And in this case, they're all Polaroids. That's a little, I think, wait, what's his name? Channing Tatum? No, I've got it totally wrong. Anyway, I will come back to that. Anyway, the Polaroids are all within this album, and when it came into our collection, there was a little bit of discussion about the quality of the album itself and whether it was really good for long-term preservation. And in coordination with this exhibition, we actually ended up rehousing all the photographs into sleeves and boxes within our vault. So they're no longer actually in that album. So to be able to experience the album as a thing, you can either do that on our website in the documentation that we did of that object, or now you can see them page by page. We're showing one page at a time, and this selection's from the collection gallery. And it's been really great because our conservation and object prep team were able to come up with a method where they used one of those pages out of the album to then recreate what that page looked like in the album, in the frame, so that you have that real sense of tactile, like the tactileness of the album, but also still have that ability to engage with the photographs in the way they would have been. And in this particular case, the Polaroids, mostly Polaroids, instant photographs that are in this album are quite light sensitive. So we also had our conservation and object prep team did some magic with the lights and put a motion sensor on the lights, so that you can see in the circle on the left, the red circle, the light is off on that object. So when there's nobody in the room, the object's getting less light shining on it. When you come over and you set off that motion sensor, then you do get light on that object. So lots of different ways that we're working to preserve things as we put them on the wall by rotating them out. And in this case, those are rotating out every 3 months, by not putting as much light on them. One of the objects in the exhibition has a curtain. So lots of fun ways that we're doing our best to keep these objects in perpetuity. Another wonderful aspect that we wanted to include was groupings of objects, so that you got more than one thing from the same time period, instead of, doing modernism in one photograph. You might get 4, you might get 8, so that you really have a bigger, broader sense of the history of photography. And in this particular case, this is a grouping of photographs by photographers from Group F64, which was a group that formed on the west coast of the United States in the 1930s. And really, everybody knows Ansel Adams pretty much, right? We have a lot of visitors that come to our museum and they want to see Ansel Adams. That's like the bucket list item. Want to be able to check off that I saw an Ansel Adams photograph. But for me, a photo nerd, I love Ansel Adams, but I've seen it a lot, right? And so I like to see other things like Edward Weston, Imogen Cunningham. And in this case, we also included Sonia Niskoviak, which is probably one of the lesser known individuals within Group F64, but all of these photographers were part of that group. And Sonia Niskoviak owned a portrait studio in San Francisco, was very active within the photographic circles there, particularly among women artists. And in this case, her photograph of Carlos Dyer, who's a artist and museum specialist, was stunning. Like the first time I saw it, I couldn't take my eyes off of it because it's such a beautiful portrait. And so being able to include her work, as well as a better known photographer like Ansel Adams, really helps expand people's knowledge of a time period and a group like that, like F64, where you don't always get to see kind of the lesser known folks. It also allowed us to show landscape, nature studies, and portraiture from that group to really give an example of the many methods that people were using under that same auspice. The final thing I wanted to highlight was that we wanted to think about how we might be able to put the photographs in dialogue with the technology in the room. And one of my favorite technology objects that's currently in the room is this lunar orbiter payload. It is an amazing, mind-blowing device. And there's a video of our colleague Todd Gustafson, the curator of our technology collection, talking more about this online. So I highly recommend watching that. But what's fun is that in the exhibition now, when I'm in that room giving tours, showing people things, I can explain what's going on with this payload to the best of my knowledge, and then show a photograph as a result of what would have come out of this process. And really the key here is that you see that striping, that kind of stripes that go across the photographs that would have been kind of from these rolls and strips of film that were then assembled together after the lunar orbiter had traveled over the moon's surface. So to be able to illustrate that in within the same space is a really fun thing, and was a good challenge too. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Jamie. As Jamie said earlier, I am a relatively new member of the Department of Photography here at the George Eastman Museum. And personally, coming in as this show was getting prepared to go up on the walls, and helping at that point in writing some of the interpretive material. And then in more recent months, helping prepare swaps for certain sections, it's been a real process of discovery. A great thing about the framework that Jamie and Louis created for this show is that each of these subsections within the exhibition highlights an area of the collection that is especially deep. And in coming in and joining them in preparing future iterations of this show, it's given me an incredible opportunity to explore some of those deep areas of the collection. I'm going to highlight two of them today and give a sense of some of my and our thinking around the new swaps that are going in the coming months. And I'll begin here with a section of the show on the first wall that highlights early photographic vernacular and popular forms. There's a pin mount case at the top that has many card-mounted photographs as well as uncased tintypes. And then there's a vitrine below with many cased objects and examples of photographic objects like jewelry, and in this installation shot, photographic paperweight. What I love about this section is that it shows how photography was integrated into it was integrated into every corner of popular culture so early in its history. And the ways that the kinds of objects that people would be encountering from the mid-19th century on ranged from light amusements to deeply personal, sentimental objects like portraits. So in our next slide, this is a comparison of, at the top, the original install of this pin mount case, and at the bottom, the swap that's going in that just went in. And in the next slide, I want to highlight how many of these objects have never been exhibited at this museum before. So the two things that just receded are the only two that have been seen in our museum galleries before these exhibitions. In the next slide, we have the same for the case below. So if we continue, there's just three things that have been, we've been able to find an opportunity to exhibit before. These popular forms are something that the George Eastman Museum has always collected and has great depths in its collection of this material. And it's something that can be said to make this collection somewhat unique from other museum photography collections, the extent to which this has been a key focus of the collecting of this institution. In our next slide, here is just highlighting the new install of that pin mount case with various small card-mounted objects in one tintype. And I'd like to talk in our next slide about the two stereoscopic view cards that were on the right before. The stereoscopic view is a popular form that creates a three-dimensional illusion by making two images that are taken at a small distance apart. If you look at the bas-relief of a lion in this library on the top card, you can see that the angle that you're looking at it in each image is slightly off. And that difference corresponds to the difference or the distance between your eyes, and allows, when you look at it through a special viewing device, like the man in that library is, for a really surprising experience of three-dimensionality, much like a ViewMaster. The top image is published by Underwood and Underwood. They created an elaborate system where you could purchase a set of stereoscopic views and experience virtually different places around the world that came with not just the captions printed on the card, but also maps and guidebooks. So you could have a virtual experience of traveling that might even inform a real experience of traveling to that place, where you could find the exact spot that the photographer's camera was set up. And at the bottom, I've wanted to juxtapose this with an image of downtown Rochester. and show how people were able to experience part of the city that's very familiar to our local viewers. And also share with you that as a new person in Rochester, getting to know this job and this city at the same time, I've come to know the city through these older materials and sometimes been surprised that, as in this example, that pink building on the corner no longer is there, and the hand-colored yellow building in the distance is not yellow. So you can't always trust what you're seeing in these photographs. The next section I'd like to highlight here is another virtual experience of Rochester. This is Google Street View showing just how much has changed, but those last two buildings in the distance are still there. But in the next slide, I want to highlight a different section. This section is around the corner from that one and highlights an art movement within photography known as pictorialism. And pictorialism was an early art photographic movement that happened internationally that truly organized artists as a collective group arguing in similar ways for photography's potential as an art medium. These photographers were able to support each other in camera clubs, in exhibitions, and in journals that circulated internationally to learn from each other and share their work with each other and with a wider audience. This section was set up by Jamie and Louis originally with a great conceit that it would enable a process comparison. So all 5 of these original images were selected to show this expressive toolkit that pictorialist artists created by learning many different printing processes and sometimes switching between them with the same negative or even combining them on the same print in some examples. In our refresh of this part of the exhibition on the right, I made sure to continue to have that opportunity to talk about different processes. So all 4 of these images by different artists on the right are different processes that were used by pictorialists. But I also wanted to take that opportunity to keep this exhibition in dialogue with itself and with other exhibitions that will be on view at the same time. So in our next slide, or I guess the next one, thanks, Jamie. This image by Gertrude Kezibier that we've titled Gargoyle in Latin Quarter from the year 1901 shows Kezibier using the gum bichromate process, experimenting with process and technique. But it's an interesting dialogue, not only within this exhibition, but with another exhibition that's about to open called Life with Photographs. That's our 75th anniversary show. And in that upcoming exhibition, Louis Chavez has created a section called Photo Groups that highlights the photo secession, a group of organized photographers who supported each other and together created opportunities for their own growth and their own display of images. Kezibier was a part of that group, but she also had a much wider artistic circle. And one reason why I'm excited about this print is it shows one of her frequent collaborators and close friends, Frances Delahanty, who was a fellow student at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and an illustrator. They traveled to Paris together in 1901, where they made this image, where playfully Delahanty is positioned as though she's a gargoyle hanging off the side of a building in the Latin Quarter. But what's really striking about this image is just how modern it appears, even for its early date of making. Delahanty's silhouetted form is abstracted by that limited information. There's this rhythmic pattern of rectilinear forms on the right, on the side of the building. And then this kind of shocking aerial view that in the gum bichromate becomes kind of uncertain as she's able to manipulate the print and suppress some of the information. This print hangs next to two later prints by Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen, who were members of the photo secession, but in later years, somewhat distanced themselves from their earlier production and some of their earlier colleagues. And I like how this print will sit next to them and insist that their later, more modern work is in line and is part of a continuum with these earlier movements.
So Daniel was just alluding to how this grouping is next to a pairing of Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen's work, and that's what we're seeing here. It's another kind of photo duo that they didn't necessarily work together. They definitely knew each other, but they're often compared within the history of photography. And to be able to compare them here on the wall and provide, where in the past we might have only been able to include one of these two photographers, here we can include both and also give you a chance to compare the work that they're doing at a similar time or of similar subjects. So in this first pairing, we see Alfred Stieglitz with a photograph of his wife, the painter and artist Georgia O'Keeffe. And on the right, a photograph of Gloria Swanson by Edward Steichen that was probably made for Vanity Fair Vogue, as he was the lead photographer for that magazine organization. And I love the kind of difference in the strikingness of these two portraits, one with Georgia O'Keeffe looking off longingly into the distance, kind of in that structured space that, like Daniel was just talking about, like Gertrude Casabir had set up with the architecture, as opposed to the one of Edward Steichen, which kind of tends towards this emphasis on the screen, the lace that's across her face. And an alternate title that we often see with this one is Gloria Swanson, a much screened lady. But in the upcoming pairing that we're going to include in the exhibition, we wanted to try something different. In this case, it's a much later photograph of Georgia O'Keeffe by Stieglitz. And it's just focusing on her hands, really looking at one aspect of her. It's about 10 years later than that previous image. So again, people who are able to come back to the exhibition can really look at different portions of a photographer's career, or again, different subjects. In Edward Steichen's case, this is one of his wives, Dana Steichen. We have many images of Dana in our collection, and this one's particularly dramatic with the emphasis of her hand on her forehead. But being able to, again, compare different photographic processes that the photographers were using, different subjects that they were photographing, and kind of similar things that were happening in their lives. Another thing that we wanted to highlight were just very unique objects that were within our holdings. And in this case, this is work by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And this particular work on the left that's in our collection is one of about 5 that are in our holdings that, as far as I'm aware, and if somebody else knows of one, let me know, but there's no other photo collages of this type in any other collection that we're aware of. So somehow we ended up with the kind of original collages for these photoplastiques that he made. And so I want to just explain that for Moholy-Nagy, the item on the right, that very plain black and white, reduced kind of contrast, very contrasty image, I should say, was the end product. That was what he was hoping to make by making these photo collages. So the collages themselves were kind of a negative or an inner positive that then made this other object. And it was really about the democracy of being able to provide photography to a wide audience, perhaps using it on the cover of a publication, magazine, or providing smaller prints that many people could own rather than one unique object. So again, we have several of these in our collection, and it's really fun to see them. Some of them incorporate, you'll see in the titles, or in the medium lines, offset lithography, photography, ink, pencil, lots of different media that he's using to create these images. He might be appropriating images out of magazines and books, or rephotographing them with his own camera and making them as photographs. So lots of different ways that the images come together. In this final example, I just wanted to show one more example of the photoplastique against the original object. And in this case, the photoplastique is from MoMA's collection in New York. And I'll just say we have no photoplastiques in our collection, right? So we've got this odd collection of really rare objects that no one else has, but not really the thing that the artist was trying to end up for. So that's not to say that what we have isn't wonderful. They're amazing. And to be able to see the different media and the way he incorporates them together is great. But having these examples of the end product is also a wonderful way to share these objects in the presentation. And one of the things that we like to do for behind the scenes is each of our rotations tends to get a vault to wall video. We want to show you what it looks like behind the scenes when an object gets selected for an exhibition. So in this case, one of the photo collages is documented as it's pulled out of a drawer in the vault. Here, myself and our cataloger, Alan Phoenix, are measuring it and recataloging the object. In this particular version, there wasn't a lot of conservation work to do, so we emphasized other aspects of how we prepare things for exhibition, including clearing copyright, making digital images, compiling research. Also, you see the framing process, and you see it getting put on the wall. So if that's something you're interested in watching, it's available online, and there's a whole backlog of other ones as well that show lots of different aspects of getting things ready for exhibition. I'm now going to turn this over to Louis, and I'll just say that I think on Louis' day one, I said, hey, you just started, but will you co-curate this exhibition with me? And it was a really wonderful experience to just get to see people dig through the boxes in our vault and find objects and bring them out and see things that I personally didn't see. So I really appreciate the collaboration that we have.
Yeah, I also started around the same time as Daniel last year, and I had just come from a photography and related media program at RIT. So I was already a member of the Eastman Museum as a student, and I'd also researched a few items in the collection prior to coming here. But yes, when I started with Jamie, I thought it was a really fantastic opportunity both to directly engage with these objects and also to gain more experience, both writing about them, researching, presenting them in the gallery spaces. And I thought this prompt was also really wonderful because I'm really excited about this museum collection for that breadth that Jamie has been describing. Another example that I think we could talk about when we think about the rich holdings of the museum's collections are these notable photographs by the Farm Security Administration photographers like Dorothea Lange, who you see here on the top right, and early documentary processes and practices that artists were using for both publication and promotion of government programs like the New Deal during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. But also, we wanted to highlight items that were of a similar vein that were less represented throughout the history of photography. So you can see in the top left, there's a photograph by Aaron Siskind here, which is another deep holding of the museum's collection. And in this case, it is a photograph from his series called Harlem Document. And then also on the bottom left is a work by Gordon Parks, which is promotional work done for the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. So you can see already how the sort of notion of documentary to document or create a humanist impulse within the medium is also being used and employed for public relations by companies like this too. In the next slide is a closer view of Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. And then the one following this slide is a photograph by Louis Hine, which is also another strong holding in the museum collection. Louis Hine worked prior to doing more of the child labor documentary photography work. He worked for the ethical cultural schools in New York City. And this photograph was really fun to include because earlier in the year, we were planning the celebrations of the Rochester being in the path of totality for the solar eclipse that happened in April. So we wanted to have objects in the gallery space that also alluded to both this history within the medium and also our museum's programming that was happening at that time as well. In the next slide, you see another advancement in the documentary tradition, this time by artists like Robert Frank and Lee Friedlander, Minor White, and Danny Lyon. And these artists were embracing some of the visual language that had been established by documentary photography practices, but also sort of breaking with the notion that a photograph is always an objective document. They also wanted to embed their work with aspects of their own personal interest and creativity, their own voice and visual language. So you can see in the next photograph, for instance, a work by Minor White made here in Rochester, New York. And he was at the time very much interested in Zen Buddhism and Eastern spirituality and philosophies. And he was really experimental with his photographs. He's creating a document of his living space here in Rochester, but he's also capturing the light in a unique way. So yeah, those artists I think are another addition to these earlier practices, and we'll also see later in the presentation kind of more contemporary updates to photojournalism and personal documentary. And the next slide, I'll also talk to you a little bit more about the Andy Warhol album that Jamie was describing earlier, and how this was a fun opportunity to be able to include these works, because although the time frame in which they can be displayed in the gallery is somewhat limited, it also provides us with opportunities to show more of it throughout the course of the exhibition. So this photograph here shows you these 6 portraits that Andy Warhol had taken during a session, and they are photographs of the gallerist Leo Castelli, who was involved very much involved in the lives of the artists he represented during the time of pop art and modernist art in New York City in particular. The next image that we'll see in the slide here is not the one-for-one that Andy Warhol would have used to make his silkscreen portrait, but it is an example of, from the same session, the type of silkscreen print that Andy Warhol would have made from these photographs. The next slide also has one with Nan Kempner, who was a fashionista, a really notable fashion icon and Upper East Side host, as she's referred to in the literature. And Andy Warhol was commissioned by people like Castelli or by Warhol to create portraits of them as well. So thought those were just kind of a couple of other fun examples to compare how the original Polaroid would have been later used in the silkscreen process. In the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of this personal documentary projects that these artists were taking on. You see in the top left, we have work by Diane Arbus. On the top right is work by Mary Ellen Mark. Going counterclockwise, Jeffrey Hinton Scales, and then Nan Goldin as well. And these are artists who are using the camera in their personal lives or to take on their own personal projects. Very much just capturing things that they felt were significant that might not have always been represented within visual culture and within the history of photography. Some of the work is also just very notable too. If you go to the next slide, Jamie, we have a closer view of the Mary Ellen Mark photograph that she created at Ward 81, which was in the Oregon State Hospital in Salem, Oregon. And Mark had arranged access to this to create a documentary portrait of both the space and people who were living at Ward 81 at the time. The next the next image here shows you how, in addition to creating a grouping of personal documentary work, we're strong in certain holdings. We have lots of work by Mary Ellen Mark. We have a couple of works by Diane Arbus and by Jeffrey Hinton Scales, but we only have 1 or 2 works by Nan Goldin. So Jamie, will you please advance? Now you see from that one slide to the next how we've changed out the objects in that area with works by the same artists in most cases, but we're also incorporating works by Eli Reed now or other artists who are taking on personal documentary projects. So those were really kind of more challenges as we prepared this exhibition to think about, okay, we don't have an exact 1-for-1 ratio or something else that can replace this object, in such an exact way, but working with our object prep team and the conservators here at the museum, they were able to do a really fantastic job to help us try to bring in new works into the gallery space throughout the run of the exhibition. In the next slide, we have the corner view, which is toward the end of the exhibition. We have on the left a couple of more photojournalistic type of works by Artists working both 30 years ago and also as recently as 2021 during the January 6th insurrection at the state capitol, the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. And on the right, we have a couple of works that are more related to moving image and cinematic traditions within photography as well. So we have a work by Jeff Bridges of, it's a photograph that he created while on set of The Fisher King with Robin Williams. And then on the right of that is a conceptual work by Hiroshi Sugimoto, who is creating very long durational photographs throughout the entire throughout the entire projection of a film in a theater. So I invite you to come to the gallery tomorrow and have a chance to look at those closely. And the next slide, here's just a greater detail view of the photograph that Ashley Gilbertson took of Officer Eugene Goodman during the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And this is just an opportunity for me to tell you about how, in addition to all of the works that we have on display, both the photographs and the technology objects in the gallery, we were also able to record audio stops so that you can take a tour of the gallery on your own, but also have your headphones in, or if you're at home and you wanted to view this, you can also download the Bloomberg Connect app and hear both us curators in the exhibition, as well as in that case, Ashley Gilbertson talking about his time taking that photograph on January 6th. On the next slide, you can also see the sort of what you'll expect to see if you open up the Bloomberg Connect app. So you see our current exhibitions listed here on the left. In the middle, you have the sort of detailed view of the objects that are on view in that gallery. And on the right, you have the very granular view, as well as the audio of us recording interviews or segments that talk more about those works in greater detail as well. And lastly, this last slide just shows you how in Ashley Gilbertson's case, there are 3 different sections of the audio that was recorded by a former colleague here at the museum. And Ashley Gilbertson talks, I think, for a total of about 12 minutes about his time as a photojournalist, both working in Iraq and other tense situations, as well as up to the present. And this is, again, one of the more recent photographs that we have in the exhibition as well. So I'll turn it back over to Jamie to talk more about how the galleries all come together and where we're at with the show now.
Yeah, so where we're at now with this exhibition is we're going to keep changing things out. You might see a bigger change out coming because just as we've been trying this kind of thought experiment of having this permanent selection from the collection space, changing things out on a very regular basis has been a lot of work for everyone at the institution. So we're trying to figure out a different rhythm for that. So so do come and see the photographs and see whatever else comes into the space next. But we're going to continue on in this kind of large groupings, showing highlights from our collection, showing the major things that people want to see when they come to a history of photography museum, so that those things are available for all of our visitors. And as Daniel alluded to, we also collaborated, the 3 of us, along with our colleague Phil Taylor, collaborated on an upcoming exhibition, Life with Photographs, 75 Years of the Eastman Museum. And this is, we opened to the public in 1949 and started showing photography exhibitions, and really us thinking about what it is that we are now in charge of, right? What we're now caring for as a team of curatorial folks here at the museum. And so we have come up with kind of 7 different vantages to look at the history of photography from, and to look at our collecting practices, our exhibition practices, and thinking about our institution's history, as well as, again, that idea of the history of photography. I'm going to call out the histories of photography. I think all of us agree that there's many, many different histories of photography as the world moves on. In this case, the exhibition starts with pre-photography, and this object on the far left in this particular slide is by Louis Jacquemont Daguerre. But it's not a photograph, it's a print that he made well before he was part of the duo that created the daguerreotype. And so it's really fun to see kind of those objects that are in our collection that are really have always been part of our collection, and they're part of the collecting practices of people who are interested in photography, like Gabriel Cromer. They wanted to establish this history as part of art in the continuum. And so those things are really part of how we think about the history of photography moving forward as well. There's a section on documentary photography and really thinking about that as an expanded idea. There's a section on portraiture, which you see this Seng Pon Chi kind of representing, but again, really expanding our notions of portraiture and how pictures of people come into being or how they're used. The concept of the exhibition comes from a quote from Lucia Maholi, who happened to have been married to Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. In this case, she talks about life without photographs is no longer imaginable. And I'll go ahead and read the quote. Life without photographs is no longer imaginable. They pass before our eyes and awaken our interests. They pass through the atmosphere, unseen and unheard, over distances of thousands of miles. They are in our lives as our lives are in them. Now, I want to note that she's writing this in 1939, so almost 100 years ago. And that idea of photographs being all around us and passing through the air is even more so now that everything is digital and really traveling through the ether. But in those early days of photography, and again, Daniel talked about the photo group section that Louis worked on. We have groups like this one on the left, the subjects representing are amateur photographers who are just sending each other pictures in the mail, trying to get feedback from each other, as opposed to the Ming Smith on the right is representing a group called Kamawinge, where Black photographers were coming together to get feedback from each other and to kind of bring forth their photographic careers in a world where they were not as accepted as they should have been. Other areas of the exhibition emphasize things like art forms in photography and kind of the format of using photos as art. And also structures, like, well, I guess I'll say the structures of knowledge, right? The way that knowledge is passed through photography. And in this case, these two objects, the Candida Hofer and the Doublier daguerreotype that's on the right, are very different sizes. When you come and see them in person, the Hofer is very large, the Doublier is very small. And they're both trying to relay some aspect of our world that not all of us can go and see. So it's really fantastic to look at how these objects are being compared in the exhibition as well. And it's been wonderful to see how my colleagues have come to interpret our collection. And I'm excited to bring it to all of you. The last section that I haven't spoken about yet is called Questioning Photography, and it's a section I worked on thinking about what is a photograph? How do we know what a photograph is? Is something that is produced digitally or without a negative or with a Xerox machine, are those things photographs? And those are questions we answer all the time, but I wanted to present that to all of you. So here's a couple of examples from that section. It's a little bit more contemporary. Thanks for your attention today. Again, the selections from the collection exhibition is ongoing. For those of you who are in Rochester or planning to visit Rochester, there's some version of it on the wall, including the technology objects as well. There's always our virtual exhibition available online for those folks who can't make it to Rochester. We do put the photographs, the text, everything online, and you can kind of walk through the gallery space in a virtual situation. There's also the audio tour, which is a really fantastic way to kind of get more information, and some of those are geared towards families. So you can check that out on Bloomberg Connects. And as Emma mentioned before this, we were down to 2 slots remaining for our members tour, but our members always get a little extra behind the scenes. So if you're interested, there's a tour tomorrow at 10 a.m. if there's seats still available. And so at this point, again, thank you for joining us, and we're going to look at the questions and see if there's anything we should answer.
Thank you so much, Jamie, Daniel, and Louis. This was wonderful. You really did a great job encapsulating how wonderful and rich our collection is here at the George Eastman Museum. So thank you so much for your time in putting this presentation together. For folks that are with us, please put your questions in the Q&A. That should be at the bottom or top of your screen. We are not monitoring the chat for questions, so if you have some, please put them in the Q&A box. We do have one to start with. So I will read that to you now. In addition to Bloomberg Connects, can you use QR codes to allow people to see other prints from the same negative, alternative views, supporting material, what pictures made with particular cameras in the technology collection look like
We haven't started to do that in depth yet, but that is certainly a dream that would be fantastic on the label to show related objects. That was actually the F64 group that I talked about. I was like, well, man, you know, we have to show Ansel Adams. Maybe I can put a QR code there to show people other photographers from that same grouping so that they're really expanding their knowledge. A little bit of a, if you like this, you might also try that. So that is a great idea, and it is something that we're thinking towards. One of the things you can do on our collection search page is when we've been able to make those connections, those relationships between objects, you can often see the positive and negative if they're both in our collection, related objects that are in the same album. We don't have a lot of examples where we can say this camera made this object, so we don't have that kind of thing, but I understand what you're getting at there. Alternate views and other things that are related to those objects. So that is something that we're working on building, and hopefully we can include in future exhibitions.
There is a question that says, when is the next permanent collection exhibition?
So this exhibition is ongoing. There's currently another exhibition from the Department of Photography that's new acquisitions that's got another couple of weeks left. And then the 75 years of photography, the Life with Photographs exhibition is also from our permanent collection. So all of the things that are kind of coming up are permanent collection shows. We do sprinkle in some contemporary artists in there. So we have Stanley Walakal coming up this fall. And then in addition to that, there's always the house. There's the permanent collections of the technology collection that are on display as well.
Okay, just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A forum, not the chat. Just for those who have more questions, we have a couple more minutes here. One question is, would you ever just have a show of Danny Lyon?
If we had all the time and the space in the world, I definitely. Yeah, there's so many photographers. Go ahead, Louis. So many
I was just gonna
photographers
say, we're
I'd love
big
to
fans,
highlight.
of course, that would be wonderful. But yeah, depends on our time and space considerations.
Okay, I think we have one of the more difficult questions in the chat. What are each of your favorite photos at the Eastman?
I can get started.
Okay, you go first.
I always have this one ready, and we've already shown it today. There's a work by Betty Hahn that will be in the 75th anniversary show Life with Photographs called Soft Daguerreotype, which takes the form of a daguerreotype, which as someone who's more of a specialist in 19th century photo, I'm very familiar with, and makes it a soft sculpture, almost like a stuffed animal. I love the humor of that piece and the craft of it, and I'm always surprised by it, even though I bring it up on my computer very frequently.
For me, that's a bit like asking a parent to name their favorite child when they have 500,000 children. So yeah, but there's a photograph that whenever I just need a moment to remember the fantastic things that we're a part of here. I go to the Imogen Cunningham box and pull out this photograph of Mount Rainier that is just beautiful, kind of pictorial, modern mashup that she made. It's a beautiful print, and it has a couple of little spots on it. So I like to look at it on a regular basis because there are some deterioration concerns with it, but it's a wonderful thing to get to look at.
I always have a hard time with this question too. I guess today I'll pick just generally that we have these wonderful holdings of Julia Margaret Cameron's work. And I think whenever people who are really into early Victorian photography visit the museum, they're always wanting to see Cameron because the prints themselves are really just so gorgeous and produced in such a, I think, a specific and unique way for the time that they were created. And so they're just another item that, like Jamie's mentioning, whenever I get a chance to see, I'm like very thankful that I get to be around these objects that way.
All great answers. And also one of the questions that maybe has no wrong answers for us. Another question is, how much of the collection is digitized and available online for research?
That's a really good question, and that's one that I've been working on for a while. We've been in the process of inventorying the Department of Photography collection. Again, that's only one collection, one portion of the collection here at the Eastman Museum. So not speaking about technology, moving image, the George Eastman collection, the library, just the Department of Photography. Again, we estimate that we have about 500,000 photographs, but we're working on an inventory. I'd say that at this point, we might be 30 to 40% digitized. We were one of the first institutions to begin digitization of our collections in the 1970s, believe it or not. And because of that, we ended up redoing the process a whole bunch of times. So we're just doing it again, and it's lots of fun to see things come onto the online website. We on our team have an ongoing list of things that we want to see cataloged and digitized, and luckily we have a complementary collection management team in our department who's constantly adding things to our website as well. So there's always new things, but it's a really good portion of our collection is online, at least 70%. And I would, again, 30 to 40% of it is really well represented with images as well.
Great, thank you, Jamie. A good question. Are there any works in the collection that can't be photographed or handled due to sensitivity to light?
Do you want to take that one, Daniel?
Sure. There are certainly objects in the collection that, for various reasons, whether they were made very early in photography's history or were made in experimental ways or by people who were a little more welcoming of some chaos in the darkroom, have been left in a state where they're still very light sensitive. There are other objects where they're so strange that we're not entirely certain if they're light sensitive or not at this point. I think plenty of those things are things that we wouldn't be able to just put up in a case or in a frame in the gallery, but we certainly want to find ways to make them available to people. And so in terms of photography of those objects, we have very recently imaged some things that are a little more concerning to us, but with the understanding that that briefest of exposure to light as the camera flash goes off, the trade-off is worth it if it means that we can deliver those images to our audiences.
And I'll just add, during one of our recent grant projects, the Alden Scott Boyer project, the team had to deal with that in photographing and cataloging the Pencil of Nature by Henry Fox Talbot. And so there is a video, I believe, of that also on our website somewhere that kind of goes through that process. But they ended up photographing it and cataloging it under red light to reduce that light, just like you'd have in a darkroom space. And that's a methodology that we've kind of deployed to do other very light sensitive things as well.
And I'll just shout out our incredible colleagues across the museum, from collection management to object prep to our conservation team, that make these things possible here, that are able to do research into objects that we're maybe afraid to open the box of to see what could possibly be in there, and are able to safely handle and to investigate those objects. And of course, our incredible photographer who makes this all possible as well.
And I
Okay.
think,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Did we run out of time?
Well, we are at 2:02, so I think we can have one more question for the folks that are still here and with us. But if you want to finish your thought.
Do you want to pick the question while I finish my thought?
Yes.
I see one of the collections about the vault to wall videos and how wonderful they are. And is it a specific department that makes that, or is it collaborative? It is definitely a collaborative project across our teams. While the communications team might kind of do the coordination of creating the video and editing the video, everybody from the registrar's department, the library, the the department whose object is being featured, conservation, object prep, everybody is working on a document together, trying to figure out what that process looks like so that then it can be illustrated and storyboarded and then turned into a video and then, you know, overdubbed and all of those things. So there's a lot of work that goes into creating those videos, which is why we only do 1 or 2 a year. But they're fun to do and they're definitely collaborative.
Thank you for answering that one. The last question that I have in mind was similar to the previous question regarding conservation. And it is that, do you find that objects that have been in the collection have degraded to the point where they end up being removed?
I've now been at the museum for 17 years in some capacity as a curator. And there has been a few times where we have deaccessioned objects, so removed them from the collection because of their deterioration. In one case, we all love the thing so much, it's still in our study room. It's this beautiful, large glass plate negative of a woman, but the emulsion is literally curling off of the glass. It's a very large glass plate negative. The emulsion's curling off the glass, so we could no longer really keep that thing in the idea of using it for exhibitions or anything like that. But now it's sort of part of our study collection. If a conservator wanted to work on it or examine it or look at it more closely, it's there and available. Other objects were degraded to the point where we couldn't even tell what they were anymore. And so those were removed from the collection as well. We do a very thorough documentation with our registrar's office when anything like that occurs. Our board has to okay that deaccessioning. We do a lot of justifications for those kinds of things. It's a lengthy process, but it's worth it so we can kind of make sure that we're caring for the things that we need to care for, and the things that we can no longer care for because there's nothing to care for aren't taking up our time.
Great, thank you for that. And I apologize to the folks that have asked questions. There were so many good questions today. If you have questions that you would like to continue to ask curatorial team, one of you please correct me if I'm wrong, but I was just going to send them to info@eastman.org, and that will be directed to the correct staff member who can help answer your question. But I appreciate Jamie, Daniel, Louis, thanks again so much today for the presentation and your time and answering these questions. This was so wonderful. I look forward to seeing members at tomorrow's member tour at 10 a.m.